The bright studio lights bore down like unfeeling sentinels, casting long shadows over the glossy black interview table. Across from the host sat Evelyn Monroe, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The audience was silent, the air thick with anticipation. "I was blindsided," Evelyn said, her voice tight but controlled. "I had no idea what was happening behind the scenes." The host, a sharp-featured man in his 40s, leaned forward. "Walk us through that moment. When did you realize something wasn't right?" Quote. Evelyn swallowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing across her face. "I think the real moment of realization came when I saw the footage. Not just the footage they showed me, but the footage I should have been in." The host frowned. "Explain." Evelyn took a breath, steadying herself. "I had been part of that party. I had walked through those doors, stood on that balcony, spoken to those people. But in the final cut of the broadcast, I wasn't there. Not even for a second. I had been erased." A murmur rippled through the audience. The host's eyes flickered toward the producer off stage, but he masked his unease quickly. "Are you saying someone intentionally edited you out?" Quote. "It was more than that," Evelyn said, shaking her head. "It was as if I had never existed at all." The host hesitated, then gestured for the control room to play the clip. The screen behind them flickered to life, showing a lavish mansion party bathed in golden light. Well-dressed guests milled about, laughing and drinking beneath chandeliers the size of small planets. But Evelyn wasn't there. "I was standing right next to him," she said, pointing to a sharply dressed man in the clip. "I put my hand on his shoulder. I remember the texture of his jacket. I remember what he said. But there's no trace of me." The host nodded slowly. "That is unusual." "That's not the worst part," Evelyn whispered. She leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't just the footage. People started forgetting me." The audience stilled. The host's face twitched in what might have been a nervous tic. "What do you mean?" Quote. Evelyn's eyes darted toward the exit as though considering escape. Then she spoke, her voice firmer than before. "The people I had known for years suddenly had no recollection of me. My agent, my co-stars, my own sister. They looked at me like I was a stranger. And when I pulled out photos, old messages, proof that I had been part of their lives, they would stare at it, confused, and then something would shift in their eyes. It was like their minds just adjusted. They believed the new reality, as if the evidence itself had never existed." A chill settled over the studio. Even the host, ever the professional, seemed unnerved. "Do you think this is some kind of conspiracy? A targeted effort to remove you from public memory?" Quote. Evelyn let out a bitter laugh. "I thought so at first, but then I realized something far worse." The host leaned in. "Which is?" Quote. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's not just me." The studio fell into absolute silence. Evelyn looked out at the audience, scanning their faces as if searching for something. "I met a man in a coffee shop 3 weeks ago. He was sitting alone, staring at an old Polaroid. I asked him if he was okay, and he told me he'd been erased, too. That his family no longer knew him. That all records of his existence had been wiped away." "And then what happened?" the host asked, his voice lower now. Evelyn's expression darkened. "I went back the next day. He was gone. Not just from the shop. From everything. The barista who had served him. The people who had seen us talking. They had no memory of him. And the worst part, the Polaroid I had seen in his hand, It was now in my pocket. The host hesitated. And what was on it? Quote, Evelyn reached into her purse, her hands trembling as she pulled out the faded photograph. She placed it on the table, sliding it toward him. The camera zoomed in, showing a group of smiling people at a party, all dressed in formal attire. In the center stood Evelyn, her arm draped over the shoulder of a man whose face was blurred, as though the image had been smudged. It's happening to more of us, she whispered. And I don't know how to stop it. The host cleared his throat. What do you want people to take away from this interview? Quote, Evelyn stared directly into the camera, her eyes unblinking. I want them to remember me. I want them to remember all of us. Because if they don't, we'll disappear. A hush fell over the studio. For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of her words had settled over everyone like a fog. Then, the host nodded, shifting back into his polished demeanor. Thank you for sharing your story, Evelyn. We'll be right back after this break. The screen faded to black. But when the lights came back on, Evelyn Monroe was no longer in her chair.